Phrases. A phrase is a group of words that function together as a unit. Phrases cannot stand alone, however, because they are missing a subject, a verb, or both. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so there's our book's definition. And then they have some examples of different phrases. So let's look at these examples. Start with the first one. The silver moon. Essentially, this is a noun phrase. So it ends with a noun and it has complements and modifiers to introduce it, or not to introduce it, but to complete the unit of meaning here. The silver moon. All right. Same with a boneless fish. A boneless fish. Really, it's a noun phrase. It's all focused around this noun. There's no verb in either one of these. So sometimes a phrase can be a unit of words that has the subject, or it has the verb, but or neither. It might have neither the subject nor the verb, but it cannot have both the subject and the verb. So it won't have. Let me say that in another way too. It can't have both a noun and a verb even. If it has a verb, then it's a verb phrase. If it has a noun, it's not a verb phrase, and it's maybe a noun phrase, but it's some other kind of phrase, not a verb phrase. So these two show basically noun phrases. This next one, I honestly think it makes a little bit of sense to call it a phrase. It makes a lot of sense to call it a phrase, but these have verbs, and a verb phrase has nothing but verbs in it. So I think I would say the book is wrong. We have a verb, and then we have a prepositional phrase here, and then we have a verb and then a noun phrase here, and then we have a verb and a prepositional phrase here. So let's look at this, but we're going to take the verbs out of it because those aren't really part of this phrase. What this is a prepositional phrase. Out the trash. This is a noun phrase, the river, and this is a prepositional phrase, to the top. Again, when we identify a prepositional phrase, it starts with a preposition, like out or out of. And you can remember these by remembering that mnemonic device with the cloud, and picture a bird, and the bird flies blank the cloud, blank the cloud. All right, and if you can fill in a word here, it's probably a preposition, like out the cloud or out of the cloud. Of is really implied, but or to the top, to the cloud. So, a prepositional phrase starts with a preposition, ends with object of the preposition, which is a noun or a pronoun. And let's see, what else can I say? Oh yeah, and it's not a preposition unless it starts a prepositional phrase. So if there's a verb in here, it's not a prepositional phrase, it's something else. The preposition might look like a preposition, but it might act like an adverb or something. So let's go ahead and look at the other ones. After piano lessons, another prepositional phrase, so after the cloud, right? You can sense that. In the crowded boat, in is a preposition, boat is the object of the preposition. In the cloud or in the crowded boat, right? And then again, by the cloud or by the beach. Okay, so let's see, and then we've got this last one, and what is going on here, these are verbal phrases. Jumping looks like a verb, but it is not a verb if it doesn't have a subject. Well, we can't tell for sure because we don't have the whole sentence. Because, I mean, it could be he was jumping into the water, and was jumping would be the verb phrase. So, but what's happening here is it's more like John, comma, jumping into the water, comma. We're going to offset that phrase. It's an interrupting phrase. We're going to offset it with commas. John, jumping into the water, did a backflip. All right, so even though jumping looks like a verb, it doesn't have a subject. John is not the subject. John's the subject, but not of this. John's the subject for did. Did is your verb. John did a backflip is your main clause. In fact, it's the only clause. Jumping into the water is a verbal phrase. All right, it's a participle phrase that describes the subject. You could also start the sentence with jumping into the water, comma, John did a backflip. And so that those introductory phrases that start the sentence before a main clause, like if we had done that, jumping into the water, comma, John did a backflip, it would introduce the subject, and it would basically, it's describing the subject. Okay, so this is this is an adjective, but you can just worry about it in terms of just being a verbal. And then this whole thing, jumping is the verbal, jumping into the water is the verbal phrase. Okay, so you know it's not a verb if it doesn't have a subject. If it has a verb, if the verb has a subject, it is a verb. All right, so anyway, that's what they're talking about here. To be smart. Now, sometimes to can be a preposition, like to the cloud, but other times, like in this case, to can come in front of a verb or verb form, really. To be or not to be. Anyway, to be is an infinitive. It's a verbal. So to be smart is your infinitive phrase. All right, so that's your whole phrase, to be smart, but it's a phrase. Be is not a verb here. It's a verbal. It's part of this verbal. To be smart. All right, so if to is not a preposition, starting a prepositional phrase, it probably comes before a verb, and so that makes, or not a verb, but a verb form. So then that makes an infinitive. To be is the infinitive. To be smart is the infinitive phrase. It will not have a subject, so it's not a verb. It's a verbal. Okay. There's some other types of phrases, but our book has it's not focusing on the other ones yet. But let's see. Maybe I can give you a little preview. There's also something called an appositive phrase. All right, an appositive is when you basically identify something again in a sentence. So like when you sign a document, sometimes you say, I, and there's this blank for your name, I, Mr. Barrera, and offset with a comma, hereby state how to understand appositive phrases. Well, this isn't a positive, so I won't put phrases here, but all right, so an appositive renames something that was just named, right? It clarifies it a little more specifically. All right, without putting in Mr. Barrera, we wouldn't know who I was in this sentence. Or if instead of Mr. Barrera, I put in this sentence, let's do a different one, actually. So let's change it. So sometimes it's just a word or a noun. And in fact, an appositive phrase or an appositive is a noun. So a positive phrase, let's see. All right, so here's an appositive phrase in here. Can you tell which phrase, where the phrase is that identifies something? Yes, not the bird, but a black and white penguin is a phrase that identifies the bird. And so this, a black and white penguin in this sentence, is an appositive phrase. Okay? And then let's see what other kinds of phrases. We have verb phrases, but we've already got a section video on verbs, so I'm not going to do that again. Infinitives, verbals, appositives, that should be good. All right, there's your video on phrases. But mainly, the first of all, or before we stop, mainly just remember a phrase doesn't have a noun and a verb in it. It's just has a verb or lots of verbs, and that's a verb phrase. Or it has no verbs and other things, and then it's not a verb phrase, it's some other thing. And of course, there has to be a group of words that function as a unit. Okay? All right.